Oh, wait, okay. Hello, everyone. It's so nice to see so many friends and colleagues. My name is Daniela Ozacky Stern, and it is my pleasure to open this virtual event organized by the Holocaust Studies Program at Western Galilee College in Yaacov, Israel. Our online series, which started with the COVID, continues to bring together scholars and Holocaust researchers worldwide. Today's topic, intimate violence during the Holocaust, was chosen as we believe that there is much more to be studied and said about this intriguing and overwhelming subject. As we will soon find out, the persecution of Jews by their acquaintances did not begin with the murders themselves, but was part of a developing process. Dr. Rob Rozett from Yad Vashem claims that the term intimate is appropriate to describe this type of persecution. Intimate in the sense of familiarity and close personal relationships, as opposed to cold, planned, and estranged acts. Indeed, we usually think of the Holocaust as an industrial genocide in which there was no personal contact between the persecutors and the victims, that there was distance between them, a big gap that enabled detachment and dehumanization. However, in the space of the Holocaust, we also witness the unique dynamics of what we call intimate violence, executed by people who were familiar with their victims, those who, before the war, had maintained a personal relationship of different kinds, like neighbors, schoolmates, business partners, and more, and were later caught in a murderous intersection when the rules had changed. We have brought together for tonight's or today's meeting 4 excellent scholars who will share with us their research and thoughts on this subject. Our moderator is our colleague and friend, Jan Burzlaff, who will introduce the distinguished speakers and lead the discussion. Jan Burzlaff is a William Aikman Fellow for Holocaust Studies at Harvard University. He had written and published works on pogroms and communal violence, visual history, and social relations during the Holocaust. His recent publications deal with Jews and non-Jews in the Netherlands and social dynamics and everyday life around the killing center at Rozett. I would like to mention that we are recording this session and will upload it to our website. And please keep your microphones on mute. If you have any questions or comments to our panelists, please write them down on the chat. As always, I want to thank my colleagues, Dr. Boaz Cohen, the head of the program, Jan Burzlaff, Dr. Yaron Pasher, Adi Cantor, and all the team of the Western Galilee. Thank you so much, and Jan, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Daniela. It's wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues. Greetings from Munich. Thanks for attending tonight's event. Today, we have 3 fantastic papers and a response by Professor Natalia Aleksiun. And I suggest we proceed as we listed the 3 papers on the poster before hearing Professor Aleksiun's response. So first, we have Robert Rozett, who is a senior historian in the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem. Prior to this, since 1992, he was director of the Yad Vashem libraries, and he has been at Yad Vashem since 1981 in various capacities. Robert obtained his bachelor's from Rutgers University and his master's and PhD in 87 from the Hebrew University, where he studied with Yehuda Bauer. His dissertation concerned Jewish rescue and revolt in Slovakia and Hungary. Among his many publications are, just to mention a few, Conscripted Slaves, Hungarian Jews Forced Laborers on the Eastern Front during the Second World War, Yad Vashem 2013, which was a runner-up for the US National Jewish Book Award. And his most recent book is from 2016, After So Much Pain and Anguish, First Letters After Liberation, edited with Dr. Oviedo. And his most recent articles are Competitive Victimhood and Holocaust Distortion in the Israel Journal of Foreign Affairs earlier this year, and Information about the Holocaust in Hungary before the German occupation, revisited as well earlier this year in the Journal of Holocaust Research. Robert also serves, among other many functions, as the incoming chairman of the IHRA Academic Working Group. His paper today is entitled Intimate Violence, a Significant Part of the Holocaust. And Robert, the Zoom floor is yours. Great to have you.
Thank you very much. And for those that it's good evening, and for those that it might be good afternoon, depending upon where you are. I want to thank very much Daniela for asking me to speak this evening. This is a subject that I've been thinking about for a long time. I suppose when I was working on my own book, Conscripted Slaves, about Hungarian Jewish forced laborers on the Eastern Front, it came up as a topic, and that was after, of course, the very influential book Neighbors had been published by Jan Thomas Gross. And I remember hearing Omer Bartov in a lecture when he was preparing his book on Buchach, also talking about some intimate aspects of what was going on there. So what I'm going to say now is something that some of you may have heard in various places that I've spoken about, but and I apologize if there's a certain repetition, but that's what we'll do this evening. So as Daniela said, the way people understand the Holocaust is often through the anonymous mass murder that was going on in the extermination camps, through the shootings that were happening with the Einsatzgruppe and their many partners, which is generally seen to be very anonymous. And it's really one of the hallmarks of the Holocaust, this kind of anonymous murdering and dying. But I think that what we learn when we look at sources, quite quickly we see that there's another aspect, and that's the aspect of where the persecutors knew the people they were persecuting, and vice versa. And this is really something that runs through the whole period. Sometimes it's more pronounced and sometimes less, but I really think we see it all the way through. And I suppose it shouldn't surprise us because, again, this kind of violence is part of our human history. We go back to the earliest murder we know is Cain and Abel. It's two brothers. We go all the way through. Certainly throughout history, we have this kind of violence going on. So it shouldn't surprise us at all. And it's also a part of the Holocaust. Because as much as the Holocaust has new and unique aspects, it also has other aspects that are deeply rooted in our history that we can understand too. And so we understand it from both of those aspects, I think. Okay, so if you go all the way to the beginnings and you talk about the Nazis coming into power, there's certainly intimacy involved in the very first things that are happening. And one of the most intimate situations is between children and their playmates. In her memoir, Dolly Offner, who was in Burzlaff at the age of 8, says the following. She says, life changed even more. I was too young to understand why my friend Ulla, with whom I had played marbles just the other day, would not even speak to me. She went out of her way to avoid me and walked in a big circle around me. Ulla's father was a janitor in our apartment building. Her father told her to stay away from me so she would not be contaminated. It's natural for children to be cruel. They call you names, perhaps pushed you, but it's usually ended when parents stepped in and stopped things before the behavior became too hurtful. But now parents encourage their children to be as nasty as they could be. We were kicked, thrown stones at, and even spit on. And so here are playmates. What can be more intimate than your friend turning on you, right? And certainly another very early kind of a place where there's an intimacy is in the schoolroom. There was a number of refugees who managed to get to the States in 1938, and their testimonies were taken and were published later on in something called The Night of the Broken Glass, Eyewitness Accounts of Kristallnacht. And there's a testimony by a man named Hugo Moses about his son. And I'll also read what he says about this intimate situation. He says, my son, who was then 9 years old, was from the outset placed by his teacher on a bench all by himself, while the other children sat 2 by 2 on their benches. Once he dropped his pencil on the floor and the classmate tried to pick it up and the teacher shouted, "Let the Jew pick up his own pencil." Another time, the teacher wanted to change for a coin. When it turned out my son was the only pupil in the class who could give him change, the teacher said scornfully, "No, I don't touch Jewish money." My child was not allowed to swim with the others during swimming class, and the teacher said to him in front of the other pupils, "Go into the Jordan with your flat feet. You're not allowed to contaminate German water." In class, he was not called upon a single time, and his written work was not corrected. Only once, when the class was to write an essay on the Adolf Hitler, savior of the German people from the worldwide Jewish plague, did the teacher call on my boy. "Now let's hear what you've written." When my son said correctly that his father had forbidden him to write this essay, the teacher wanted to have nothing more to do with him. Because of this gem of a teacher, the boy no longer existed in the world. On the other hand, the other teachers were good to him. So I'm not saying that in every classroom, just as he says here, that teachers acted this way. But when they did, this is very intimate kind of violence to a child. And there's no question that, again, it's very different from what we think about. If we move ahead, Kristallnacht. Well, the orders for Kristallnacht said that the SA men should be coming into other towns, not from their own towns. They shouldn't be involved in rampaging in their own towns. But we know from testimonies that that wasn't always the case. And more than once, as the rampages were going on, people recognized, people that they knew. So in a testimony that we have from a man named Sigrid Moretsky, who was a lawyer, right, in Vienna, he writes that on November 10, 1938, he was taken to an unfurnished apartment. And the apartment, an old man stood watch without a coat, but with a very large belly and a very long mustache. He was carrying a submachine gun, and I recognized him as the janitor in the neighboring building. So he recognized this man. And also, we know that in many, many cases, apartments were ransacked. Our friend, Professor Wolf Brunner from USC, just recently gave a paper about this and is preparing a book about the ransacking of apartments during the Kristallnacht and at Broken Glass. He estimates that some 10,000 apartments were ransacked that night. And so in this situation also, it happened that people knew the Jews whose apartment they were ransacking. Maybe not all the SA men, but among them were often the local people, often people like the janitor who would come in. Elaine Segell also tells in her testimony about it in Kristallnacht, how she saw some SA men beating up an old man, and then she came to a policeman who was directing traffic, and he came to her right away, and he said, "Oh, don't worry about it. It's only old Isaac, the fishmonger, a Jew and a troublemaker. So go home, little girl." So also the policeman on the scene knew the person who was being beaten up at that moment. Okay. Of course, if we move ahead into the history, and we'll hear more about this, in the period of the first pogroms that are going on as the Nazis were entering the Soviet territory, again, often this was a situation where neighbors were against neighbors. And so they knew one another. It was a situational kind of things. And even in the shootings, as Omer Bartov pointed out in that lecture I heard so long ago, that's often we have local people who are bringing the Jews towards the shooting sites and things, so they know the people that are going to be shot. I mean, it's an intimate situation as well. David Bankir's latest book, the late David Bankir's last book, was called Expulsion and Extermination, and it was about testimonies from provincial Lithuania. And in that situation too, we have testimonies where the survivors talk about people they knew being involved in one way or another in the murder, sometime in ransacking their homes. As soon as they were pushed out, they saw their neighbors moving in to take out whatever they could from the homes. There's one testimony he presents by a fellow named Yaacov Zak, and Yaacov Zak strangely gives his testimony in third person, but I'll read what he says. He says, at about 7:30 p.m., partisans began carrying off the last group of Jews from the barns to the pits. A group of 10 men. Yaakov's friends were taken away. Despairing, they left with their heads lowered and their eyes filled with tears. Only 10 men were left in the barn. 2 guards stood in position at the gate, armed with automatic weapons and hand grenades. The 2 posts were Spaklus and Merkelis, both of them Yaakov's good friends. They assured him that the remaining 10 men would not be shot. But of course, as he goes on, they were taken to the pits, and only Yaacov, Yaacov Zak, gave the testimony, somehow managed to escape this. So he knew his guards. They had been his friends, so he thought beforehand. And we see many testimonies, again, of this nature, where we're talking in this period of the shootings where Jews knew people involved in it, whether they were the actual shooters or involved in, in again, guarding or other such things. And the deportations from the ghettos in Poland as well. We have stories about intimacy. Jan Grabowski, of course, has written a lot about what's been going on in Poland, as I mentioned before, very important books that he wrote along with Barbara Engelking and others. And Grabowski talks about in the autumn of 1942 in Dąbrowa, he talks about how in the deportations there, he has a testimony of someone who says, a man named Avraham Brau, I personally knew some of the policemen. They were from Dąbrowa and from the area. I also knew that the Polish policemen had to follow the orders of the gendarmes and they worked together. And so one of the policemen involved in the action in Dąbrowa was an officer from Radogast, and he was Bravov's good friend. And Bravov writes in Jan quotes him as saying, he told me that I must have been an idiot to allow myself to get caught like this. So he spoke to him as this is going on. In the Jew hunts, as again, Jan has written about and others, we also see that it's very common that the Poles who became involved in the Jew hunts in rural Poland knew the Jews who were there hunting. And so we have plenty of testimonies about this. Jan brings them in his book, the Hunt for the Jews, and also now it's in Night Without End. You can see many such testimonies such testimonies and situations that are described in them as well. And so one of them that I'll describe also comes from Barbara Engelking in her important book, A Beautiful Sunny Day, and she writes the following. She says, Pesla Ptienchena from Klimentov wrote in her testimony that her sister-in-law and 3 children were hiding in her own lumber storage facility when it was taken over by the Troy handler Wenzel. They handed their entire property to him and were hiding in his cellar. From time to time, they went out into the fields to pull out some carrots because he didn't give them any food. In the end, he went to the police himself and told them that the Jews were hiding in his place. And this is June 1943. The gendarme arrived and shot everybody to death. So here they put trust into somebody they knew, and this is the person who then betrayed them and led to the death of these people. But of course, this is not only happening in Poland and in the East. When we look at work that's been done in France, we also see situations like this. Renée Poznański, in her book that came out quite a few years ago about the Jews in France, gave a situation in a small town where a woman wrote to the authorities about 300 Jews who escaped from Vichy to the village and then had been hiding, and she turned them in, and she turned in the names of all of these Jewish neighbors that she had now met that were living in her village. So that's a situation too. As I said in my own book on forced labor in Hungary and the Jews who were sent to the Eastern Front, this is a situation of intimacy in the sense that sometimes the men were put into the units, from their own town, and they knew some of the commanders and things because they knew them before. But even if that didn't happen, they served together for months and months and months. So as they were being persecuted, it was now by people who knew them, and the persecution was, many different ways they were persecuted, but 80% of the 45,000 or so Jews sent to the Eastern Front never returned home. A lot of it has to do with the way they were being treated by their Hungarian minders. One of the most infamous stories, and it's a story that we can't pin down the details on fully because there are different versions of it, is one that kind of is portrayed in the film Sunshine. And it's about Attila Pechauer, who was an Olympic fencing champion from Hungary, and he had won European championships and Olympic championships. And the story goes that he was in the Ministry of Defense. Somebody insulted him there. He slapped the person in the face, and then that person made sure that he would be drafted the next morning and sent to the Eastern Front. And as far as we know, he was murdered in a place called Novi Grand Kościki. One story, the main story goes that they poured water on him in very sub-zero temperature and he froze to death. The official record said that he died of disease, but the story is quite different the way it's being told by most others. But what I want to talk about the intimacy here is the unit that he sent to was under the overall leadership of a lieutenant colonel named Kalman Cseh. And Kalman Cseh was part of the Hungarian equestrian team in the same Olympics in which Attila Pechauer took part, meaning they were in the same Olympic team, which means that they knew each other. And we know that Cseh gave specific orders to treat Petchower the way he was treating him. Whether he eventually gave the order for his murder or not, we don't know. But he certainly didn't give Petchower any special consideration, and really the opposite. So here you had two people who knew one another quite well. Also in Hungary, the deportations that took place in 1944, again, the Germans come in, there's the occupation. The main deportations take place from mid-May until early July 1944. But the people carrying out the deportations are the Hungarians, they're the gendarmerie, and also the local administrations in the smaller towns are deeply involved in this whole process. And here too is a situation of intimacy, because in the smaller towns, obviously the policemen, the mayor and others knew many of the Jews who were there incarcerating and sending into the local ghettos they were setting up as they were being robbed of their possessions and going to be put on trains and sent out, most of them to Auschwitz in that period. So this too is a situation of intimacy. My good friend David Zilberklang, who wrote a book about Lublin called Gates of Tears, told the following story about a Jew named Shammai Geyer, who actually was working closely with the SS, again, in an attempt to survive. And when he was married in April of 1942, one of the SS officers by the name of Dr. Harry Sturm sent him flowers for his wedding. Geyer eventually was shot, along with his wife and new baby in November. The man who shot him was the same Harry Sturm. So that's certainly a very specific case of intimacy in which a Jew and an SS officer knew each other, and the SS officer murdered the Jew. So why did the neighbors take part and become accessories to murder? Well, there's many parts to the answer, of course. There's no one simple piece to the answer. Obviously, Nazi ideology is part of this, but certainly the German presence, with their murderous policies opened up a faucet, we could say. It opened up a way that people could persecute, murder, steal from their neighbors, treat them in various ways, more or less with impunity. And so that's the whole atmosphere of what's happening on. Certainly there were long-held anti-Jewish prejudices that people had, anti-Semitic ideas, stereotypes against Jews. And again, there's so many things involved here. You can trying to explain the perpetrators, there's no one explanation. There's so many hooks that we can hang this thing on, and any combination of them. But some of them just have to do with greed, with the belief that the Jews have money, that will persecute them and then take things from them. That's certainly an important part of it. The idea of the Jew as being the Bolshevik enemy in Eastern Europe, of course, is very strong. Anybody who's read Jerry Weidlinger's most recent book about In the Midst of Civilized Europe sees roots for this all the way back to the Civil War period after World War I, and the attacks on the Jews often by their neighbors as well, and also by people from the outside, both of those things going on then. But this belief in the Jews as being, Bolsheviks and then causing their own suffering, that's certainly a piece of what happens about why neighbors do what they do. But it just shows that as we look at it, we see how normative it was to see the Jews as the outsiders. And I think that Barbara Engelking says this very well in her book, in A Beautiful Sunny Day. And she says the following: in a situation of narrowing moral obligations, Jews were excluded from the community of citizenship, neighborhood, and fraternity, and ultimately from the human community. It is possible that this exclusion occurred much earlier. For the Christians, Jews were never fellow creatures. And I think that's a very strong paragraph that she says there. I'm not sure if you can apply it everywhere the same way she's saying it, but the Jews being the other, that's, I guess, when I was first thinking of this subject, what I really thought was the Jew was the intimate other, that you can know your Jewish neighbor, have a lot of contact with him over the years, maybe go to his store or work for him or work with them, maybe even hide him for a while, right? In certain situations, she, the family, the Jews still remain the other. Intimacy, we often think, is the antidote to being another. And maybe it's still the best tool we have when we're trying to teach about otherness, but it doesn't necessarily stop the person you see as another from being another. I think that's one of the things we learn when we look so closely at this period. And again, it's not just Jews in the Holocaust that we can see this. If you look at the book, by Slavko Goldstein, which is about Croatia, the year that keeps returning, about 1941, he portrays some of the things that happens in those villages between the villagers who up until that time, more or less, were living together, maybe not with great harmony, but we're living together. And then suddenly all of this changes and villagers turn against villagers. And he describes this in a number of situations in that year of 1941. And if you look for things like the genocide in Rwanda, much of this also is occurring between neighbors, people who knew each other. And we have testimonies of this as well. And one of them is from a woman named Hartel, who talks about her friends, Jean and Innocent. And she talks about Jean's husband, Nicholas, who used to drink beer with Innocent, and they used to fish together. But they were, of course, from the different tribes. And she says Nicholas wondered if their neighbors really had it in for them to kill their good friends. Could Innocent, as drinking buddy, really take a machete to him? And Jean knew that he could. So she gathered up the kids, all except their two grown boys, who they thought they'd be fine, and they fled to the woods. But not long after, Innocent showed up in the family's house with a cutlass. And Jean doesn't know exactly what happens, but friends later recounted what they saw. She says her two oldest boys, who had known him most of his lives, hid from him, but he found them, he killed them, then he walked to the home and told his wife, Dorcella, what he had done. So this intimacy of murder, right? This is something that's part of the Holocaust, but it's something that's part of a whole classification of genocides we might talk about. It's certainly a piece of it. So it's something we need to think a lot about. I think that Daniela is very right. More research needs to be done on the subject. There has been a lot more done, I could say, since I first personally started thinking about this close to 20 years ago. There's been a lot more done on it, and we have a lot of examples of it through the literature today. And as I say, often we try to pin it on just Eastern Europe and Poland, but it's not. It's something that really cuts across, that we can see from the moment the Nazis came into power until really much the very end of what's going on, even during the period of the forced marches, of the death marches, where guards who had some sort of contact with people also may well have, shot them for straggling. They already knew who these people were. They weren't so anonymous to them anymore. That's also a situation. Okay. So that's the opening, I guess, to try and give us a broad sweep. And when you ask questions, I'm more than ready to try to answer questions.
All right, many thanks, dear Robert. Your paper really sets the stage of the topic of intimacy. And I think that it's really important to explore the complexities and close to really personal voices and accounts as well. So thank you for this really insightful paper. To everybody, please put your questions in the chat, as always, if you have questions, and we will get to them later. Now we turn to the second paper, and we welcome Saulius Sužiedėlis, who is Professor Emeritus of History at Millersville University in Pennsylvania. From 1982 to 87, he was a research historian for the investigation of Nazi war crimes at the US Department of Justice. He is the author of The Persecution and Mass Murder of Lithuanian Jews during summer and fall of 1941 with Christoph Diekmann, who's also present, hello, in 26, and The Historical Dictionary of Lithuania, second edition, 2011, and numerous scholarly articles. Until 2010, he also served as director of Millersville University's annual conference on the Holocaust and Genocide. In 2013, Saulius was awarded an honorary doctorate in Kaunas, which is also worth mentioning, of course. A forthcoming book on the Holocaust in Lithuania is scheduled for publication next year, 2023. And his paper today is entitled Intimate Violence, the Case of Lithuania. Dear Saulius, the floor is yours.
Good morning, yes, or at least good afternoon here from rainy Pennsylvania. Welcome to all, and I'm very pleased and honored to have been invited to give this presentation. I will try to confine myself to two broader issues. One is on the question of pogroms in Lithuania in the beginning of the war and invasion of June 1941, and what may have led to them and their dynamics. And secondly, I would like to point out some instances that are specific to Lithuania. In terms when we look at some comparative history, let's say with Ukraine and particularly Poland that is mentioned here, broadly speaking, and point out what were some specific aspects which either encouraged or discouraged mass pogroms in Lithuania in the early part of the war. Now, when I looked at Wittenberg's and Kaufstein's book some time back, and I found it very useful on some level, although I think the situation in Lithuania was somewhat different from what they described in Poland. But in terms of intimate violence, I understand that in my vocabulary to mean pogroms, basically. And I will go with that assumption. And according to the Oxford Dictionary, pogrom is, and I can read it here, an organized massacre of a particular ethnic group, in particular that of Jewish people in Russia or Eastern Europe in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. But I think in a more popular vein, we think of pogroms as those events which happened in, let's say, Odessa, Kishinev in the early 20th century, so painfully described by Isaac Babel, for example. And we assume that in the pogrom, there is an element of spontaneity and of mass participation by local people, rather than killings carried out by mass organizations, governments, and so on. Yadvabne, obviously, in the newest research is one such example. We have to separate this kind of intimate violence or pogroms from what I call the operational policy of the Nazis and during the Holocaust. That is mass shootings, particularly in Lithuania, where there were no gas chambers as such, mass shootings by organized militarized groups under a centralized authority. And I've got my share screen. I hope this allows you to look at the presentation I have here a little bit. Is this visible to everyone? I hope.
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, and this is what I mean by intimate violence, pogroms. It's a organized massacre of a particular ethnic group, in particular that of Jewish people, and so on. And if we look at the broader history of the Holocaust in Lithuania, in Reichskommissariat Ostland, we're speaking, of course, of the southwestern part of this map. And the very first killings in Lithuania in large numbers, that is during the first days and week of the war, were not pogroms in this usual intimate violence sense. In fact, one of the more interesting cases is that of the town of Gargždai, which is located on the Prussian-Lithuanian border, in which some people say may have been the very earliest mass shooting of Jews in the Soviet Union, which occurred on the day of 24th of June, 1941, in which a German unit killed about, I think it was 200 people, if my memory serves me correctly. And it's an unusual event, unusual in the sense that this particular killing was carried out primarily by German units. And this pattern did not continue in later weeks and months when Lithuanian shooters became demographically the more important segment of the killers themselves. Now, if we look at the time frame for the pogroms, we have to look at first the time frame for the genocide of the summer of 1941. And this by month, June, July, August, September, October, November, and December, we see here that the most important, the largest segment of killings occurred in the months of August and September. Until by August, on August 1st, roughly, somewhere between 85 and 90% of Lithuanian Jews were still alive, persecuted, ghettoized, but alive. By the beginning of November, on the right part of the graph, almost 75 to 80% were dead. So this was the actual explosion of destruction of the Litvak society in Lithuania. And although the Jaeger account is not entirely accurate, this also gives roughly, the July numbers here are not accurate, but they're based on the Jaeger report. You see August, September as the critical moments. Now, until early August 2nd, 3rd of 1941, as a general rule, the women and children were not included in the massacres. As a general rule, there are two horrific exceptions to this that I'll mention a little later. But in beginning of August 41, the policy changes. My colleague Christoph Diekman has written extensively on the how that policy evolved. Now, what I would like to point out is that the framework in Lithuania was, the two things that I would like to point out in terms of the time frame. The two very unusual mass killings that occurred before early August of 1941. That is, ones that included the entire population of a town or a village, and not just men of military age, so-called, who were the main targets of the period, of the early period, people usually between late teens and mid-40s, the way the Germans interpreted them. And this included not only adult Jewish men, but in a secondary category, a lot of local communists who were Lithuanians or other ethnicities. The two exceptions are Plunge in mid-July 1941, in which almost 1,800 people are massacred, the entire Jewish population of one of the historic communities of Lithuania, and the smaller town of Ozacky in the north, in which about 300 to 400 Jews were killed, including the women and children. But these are the two exceptions to the kind of progress of killing that occurred in the early part of the war. One of the differences, specifically in the case of Lithuania, is that, and is the fact that it occurred in a atmosphere of great expectation of violence. What new evidence, I think that it's somewhere I have that this comment here that I don't know where I put it. Let's take a look. Oh yes, okay. Even before the war, I take these two quotes, one from an archival source and one from a memoir, was the expectation that violence would occur even before the war began. William Michel, a survivor from Cohen, in his memoir writes, the mood in the country was as before an explosion. And in another source, in an archival police report, a report on the counter-revolutionary activity of Jewish nationalist organizations by Major Gladkov, a Betar official is confiding to what he does not know is an NKGB informer, and he says about his worries about what would happen if the war broke out. And he says, this is not the time of the Smetona government. We are now living as if on a volcano. So during the first Soviet occupation of 1940-41, the expectation of violence was very strong. And now, once the war began, also the environment was one of violence. Starting with 14 June, we have, of course, the mass deportations to the Soviet Union, including the deportation of Jews. Of the roughly 20,000 people deported, they made up about 9% of the total, roughly. As the Red Army, NKVD, and the Communist Party activists retreated, they massacred about 1,000 civilians. There was, of course, the collateral damage of the war. Civilians were killed in bombings, raids, crossfire, so-called collateral damage, as we use the term in the United States, between 500 to 1,000. And then there was an anti-Soviet insurrection. About 15 to 20,000 people participated in attacking the Soviet forces as they fled, but also civilian and political clashes between armed groups, usually between Soviet supporters and anti-Soviet elements. That resulted in close to 1,000 deaths possibly. And then political killings of accused communists, not necessarily Jews, also in the hundreds during this first week of the war up to about 28 June to early July. So what we have here is an atmosphere of extreme violence to begin with. Now, this photograph, interesting one, where you see one of the anti-Soviet insurgents guarding a column of Soviet POWs during the first week of the war. This is also, these people with white armbands are guarding Jews they've arrested very early in the war. So these kinds of anti-Soviet and anti-Jewish actions are in fact being carried out. Now, in terms of general numbers, what can we say about anti-Jewish pogroms? And by this, I mean the spontaneous kind of violence, which was not, at least not publicly officially sanctioned. The largest single example of mass violence against Jews occurs in Viliampolė or Slobodka on the night of 25th, 26th June 41, in which anywhere from 600 to 1,000 Jews were killed by an armed gang led by the journalist Klimaitis. We'll talk about him a little more later. And also the infamous killing, the best photographed and best resourced one in the Lietutis garage, which is a car repair place located in the center of Kaunas on 27th June, killing between 50, 60 people. There's a shooting of Soviet POWs and Jews in Vilnius in the first week of the war. And there are numerous reports of smaller attacks on Jews that occur in other parts of the country, including the general Kaunas area. It's a problem, a real quandary when we regard the victims of individual criminal attacks, mob violence, to come up with a number. It's a reasonable assumption that the pogroms in Kaunas itself, the first two, resulted in about 1,000 deaths, majority the first one I mentioned above. And this is a figure close to the number estimated by the Kovno Gero Jewish Council in 1942. These are, of course, the iconic photos of the Lietukis killings, which occurred in full view of German soldiers and civilians, as you can see them in the background. People in German uniforms, also civilian people. And these, of course, have been published worldwide and are widely known. Now, aside from the special operations of the border zones, which I should mention briefly, there was a 25-kilometer border zone in which, as the Nazis and the Germans invaded, special operations were carried out by German police units and including some local volunteers and Lithuanian militia, targeted mainly against adult Jewish men and local communists. Aside from that, a realistic accounting of indigenous perpetrators probably killed approximately 2,000 Jews in pogroms, summary executions, individual murders, before the onset of mass killings in 4th and 6th July in 1941 at the forts. Now, again, when I say and talk about these pogroms, I want to differentiate them quite clearly from organized mass executions carried out by militarized formations, usually in uniform, under German command. Already by 1 July 1941, that is barely a week after the war had ended, the German security police had already organized several companies of Lithuanian volunteers or people that had been enlisted in carrying out both guarding of Jews and also executions. So there are a couple of things in the Lithuanian situation which are uniquely favorable to this development. One is the fact that the Germans found in Lithuania and were willing to use, unlike in Poland, a mass of men who had military training and were simply available for inclusion in military units. Many of these men came from the Red Army, the Lithuanian-speaking 29th Riflemen's Corps. There were about 12,000 such soldiers in the Soviet Army. The majority of them, we think roughly 3/4 at least, either mutinied or deserted as soon as the war began. I mean, for many of these Lithuanian-speaking Red Army men, they really didn't see any point in dying for Stalin, but they provided, when they were captured, and they were not treated differently than the Russian POWs, they did provide a pool of available men with military training that the Germans later used to good effect. Also were among the rebels who had rebelled. These men had arms and were trained. And so the pool of military manpower, is what I'm saying, was quite large. And this is one of these features that I think is more or less unique to the Lithuanian situation. Also, the fact was that when the war began and during the uprising against the Soviets as they fled, there was an attempt to create a Lithuanian government. And one of the orders it issued, this is a copy of it, order number 1, was for officials who had worked in the pre-war government, pre-Soviet government rather, to come to their offices and resume their duties as before under the rules that had prevailed under the independent Lithuanian state before 15th June 1940. So not only was there an available pool of militarily trained men, but there was also the beginnings of a civil organization of local government. Now, another contribution to the violence, of course, was intense anti-Semitic propaganda. Now, in the Lithuanian case, the Judeo-Bolshevik propaganda and myth was the most powerful tool in the sort of arsenal of Nazi propaganda. While there were a marginal group of people before 1940, that is during the interwar period, who did read German racist propaganda. A few anthropologists were involved in this and adopted these racial theories. In general, most of the Lithuanian public were not interested or did not know much about that aspect of Nazi racial thought. But the idea that the Jews had betrayed Lithuania in June of 1940 when the Soviets came was an extremely powerful element. And this refers to what I was mentioning before about this explosive mood in the country before the Germans attacked, in which many ethnic Lithuanians are praying for the war to start and somebody from the West to come in and kick the Soviets out. And the Jews, in the meantime, fearful of this attack, tended to support, in some sense, politically at least, the Soviet government. This creates an explosive situation. And what's interesting in historical research today is that while we had evidence of this in memoirs and in diaries and so on, it was the opening of the archives previously restricted, which opened up police reports, which say the same thing, reporting on the mood of the population, intensely anti-Semitic, intensely angry at the Jews as alleged Soviet traitors, and including also the propaganda of the Lithuanian Activist Front, which was the group created in Germany to fight for the restoration of Lithuania's independence, which also published and spread much anti-Semitic propaganda. But what I want to say here is that the core of that propaganda is intensely focused on the stereotype of the Jew as a communist and as a traitor to the country. What's interesting about this is the first issue of the newspaper Elisa, 24 June 1941. And what's interesting about it is that it does mention the Jews who are fleeing and how they are communists and traitors and that they are simply freeloaders and all that. But, and for the Jews, there is no salvation. They must leave Lithuania. However, in describing Lithuanian communists, ethnic Lithuanian communists, I mean, in this particular newspaper, they are granted absolution if they change their colors and they return to the nation and regret their sins. So right from the beginning, even the anti-communist rhetoric is intensely anti-Semitic, of course. Now, another thing that I would like to point out in this thing about who are the perpetrators. Now, if we had more time and available for a long lecture, we could sort of break them down. This is an interesting thing that I found in the article by Konrad Kwiat in the Holocaust and Genocide Studies. This is an iconic photograph of one of the perpetrators of the Lietukis garage killing, which I had mentioned previously. And he's described as a Lithuanian nationalist posing with the iron bar he used to kill Jews at the Lietukis garage, June 27th, 1941. And also, so many of the perpetrators are simply described as nationalists, and not only in this source. Also, we talked a whole lot about partisans. This is also another rather sticky term because it refers originally to the people who were rebels or insurrectionists in the first week of the war, anti-Soviet people who were armed, many of them who did commit violence against Jews. And yet this term continues on into the summer and even early fall of 1941 when they were no longer functioning as partisans. In other words, they were joining local police units. They came under different terms, under sharing as police, white armbands, and so on. I think it sometimes is a mistake not to be more specific about who the perpetrators are. In the Lithuanian case, coming back to the killings in Vilijampolė of 25th and 26th, what we have is that this was an armed gang. And some of these armed gangs tended to be not just simply nationalists, but came from a certain nationalist cohort. These are the different names for the pogromists and killers. The Klebaitis gang, partisans, activists, Iron Wolf, Voldemars. In other words, they're coming from the most extreme right-wing portion of the nationalist movement. And let's remember that during the interwar period, the nationalist government, in fact, had not persecuted Jews systematically and had, in fact, protected them in civil terms. So in summing up, I'm just pointing out some things that were in general about pogroms and also about some cases or features of intimate violence that were unique to Lithuania. Now, of course, as the summer progressed and the mass killings began after August 41, local police who came and convoyed people to the killing sites, in some cases knew their victims, particularly in smaller towns. And what's bizarre, if you look at some of these police documents, they refer to their victims sometimes as citizens of Jewish nationality, which is the term used during the interwar period to define ethnic minorities. So there is some intimate violence in that sense, but we, because of lack of time, I don't have enough to talk about these people. So I would suggest finally, since his name was mentioned, that there is in terms of this whole discussion of what was the violence like in the first stage of the war, we have a presentation by Dr. Christoph Diekmann at Yad Vashem a few years ago, in which he explains in detail the kind of sources he used and about the level of local violence committed against Jews in the first part of the war in 1941. So I did present here some rather, I think, let's see, the stop share on the screen. These are sort of some elements of intimate violence in the first part of the war. The subject is very large. Much more research needs to be done, and so much more has been done. Just one last item about motivation. Obviously, anti-Jewish hatred was a motivator, particularly the rage against the supposed betrayal of Jews during the communist takeover in June of 40 and during that year. But also we found evidence, particularly in the interrogation reports, which had been previously restricted, looting of property was for the more ordinary people, not so much like the officials of the police. The looting of Jewish property was an extremely powerful motivation for engaging in intimate violence. And new research on this has been very helpful. This becomes a great subject in society in 1942. What do we do with the property of people who are dead? And even the church becomes involved in this discussion in some very unique and rather disturbing ways. And so this is another motivator that would push people to commit anti-Jewish violence during the 1941-42 period. So I know this is just a few things that I've put forth, but these are elements of a larger story that I hope we'll continue to research. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, dear Saulius. A really terrific paper. Also terrible events that you describe, which raises a lot of questions about the intimacy, I think, of the events locally. And I hope we have a chance to discuss all this in the Q&A. Now we have the pleasure to welcome our third speaker, Diana Dumitru, who's the Ian Ratio Visiting Professor in Romanian Studies at Georgetown University. Her research interests include the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, nationality policies, anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, and late Stalinism and post-war trials. Diana has held multiple fellowships. I would just mention a Woodrow Wilson Center Fellowship, a Fulbright, and one at the US HMM. Her second book, The State, Anti-Semitism and Collaboration in the Holocaust, The Borderlands of Romania and the Soviet Union, was published in 2016, one of my personal favorite books in the last 10 years. Diana also sits on the boards of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, East European Jewish Affairs, and the Journal of Genocide Research. Currently, Diana is working on 2 projects together with Chet Bryan and Katerina Kapkova. She's working on a book titled The Trial That Shook the World, The Slansky Process and the Dynamics of Czechoslovakian Stalinism, and her own book, Indispensable Yet Suspect, Soviet Jews under Late Stalinism, to which we look very much forward. Her paper today is entitled 6 Modes of Violence, Jewish Mass Killings on the Territories under Romanian Control. Diana, the floor is yours.
Good evening from Chisinau, and good morning to everybody who is on the North American side. Thank you, first of all, for this kind invitation to speak today, and thank you for the kind introduction, Jan. I'll start sharing my screen promptly, and Hopefully you can see it, right? Is it good? Yeah. Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
we can see it.
So the title, I submitted somehow the title earlier than the title of the panel came up. So it is a little bit different. I'm afraid my presentation is a little bit different from the two previous presentations, but not too different. It's still somehow fitting, at least like partially, under the bigger umbrella title of intimate violence. And definitely I worked on this type of violence, on pogroms indeed. And this is like a big part of what I've been doing so far. But I chose to speak specifically today about 6 cases. So here are my cases. I put them on the map. And why did I choose to speak about these 6 cases? There is an explanation. As most cases of the Holocaust, in the one from Romania is a complex one and is messy, and it's difficult to understand the logic behind, of course, in addition to being like just having the difficulty of understanding the reason of this, but also looking through what happened and understanding patterns and understanding policies of the government. It's difficult because what's happening, geography kind of plays a role in the Romanian story. And the Romanian Holocaust somehow happened in concentric circles. So somehow the Jews from Bucharest were luckier than the others, just because despite all the persecutions and abuse that they suffered, their fate was different in a better sense compared to other circles that would go, the further east you'd go from Bucharest. If you stepped out from the territory of Old Kingdom into the territory of Bessarabia, Bukovina, it's definitely a different set of policy. And then you go to Transnistria, and that's the most lethal policy. So the worst would be on the margins, and the better relatively would be in the middle of the occupied territories. And because of this, you have a huge group of victims, like over 300,000 people died. But at the same time, you have another big group, significant group of people, over 375,000 Jews survived in the territory of Old Kingdom. So I was trying to look at these cases and understanding like who were the Jews who died and why they died, because Romania did not choose a policy, a unified policy of what to do with the Jews. And so I was trying to bring here a number of cases to kind of better illustrate and help to better understand this like complex Romanian case. I do have this as a first case. This is Iași, and then Pepeni, and then Scăieni. These are 2 small villages, actually, that the most close to the intimate violence that we're discussing today. Then there is the case of Dubasari, Odessa, and here is Bogdanovka. I'll go step by step. So here is, Iași. The war on Soviet Union started on June 22nd. And before the war already, Iași became, since it's right on the border with the Soviet Union, Iași became a city of intense concentration of both German and Romanian army. At the same time, a lot of people who were refugees from Bessarabia, they also were in high numbers in the city because some of them stopped here already in 1940. In addition to this, the Romanian army moved around some of the people from countryside inside Romania, and actually by mistake brought them here to Iași as well. So you have this like high intensity of people in Iași with a number of Jewish population definitely higher than 40,000 people. What is happening during the first days of war is that the Soviet aircrafts are bombing Yash. And as a result, around like 600 people are dead, including 38 Jewish people. But the Germans, the Romanian soldiers, and a segment of population from Yash, they are convinced that the bombardments and the casualties are the result of Jews who betrayed the Romanian state and who are signaling to the Soviet aircrafts. So the order comes from Bucharest to cleanse the city of Yash of Jews. What is happening is a messy affair, but to like kind of simplify it is that men especially are taken to the gendarmerie, and they are taken by the soldiers, by intelligence officers, by German soldiers who are in the city as well, and taken to the main police headquarters in Yash. And inside that police headquarters, over 1,000 people are killed. In the meantime, the mob is also involved in killings. And here they don't choose, if the person is a man, is a woman, or a child. So you have this carnival of violence in Yash. Then a number of people are put in trains and sent away outside from Yash. And because it's summer and the trains are fully packed and with no water, over 2,500 people die in these trains. Altogether, the victims of Yash counted over 13,000 people. But what is important for us to understand, like when we look at this case, is that the authorities, they're not ready to kill their own Jews in the entirety of the community. They're not ready yet to kill women, children. And if you see here a photograph of a woman, usually these are the women who decided to follow their husbands or whatever, their beloved, and did not want to get separated. So this is the first step. And here the Jews allegedly were killed mostly as presumed saboteurs or presumed spies or the people who were like eager to fraternize with the Soviet regime. Then we moved to the Bessarabian rural area, and there was a policy that was valid also for the Bukovinian rural area. And this is one of the most puzzling elements of Antonescu's policy that it's difficult for me to understand because I did not find one single document where the Romanian leadership is explaining why they chose it. But the point is that the Romanian authority decided to kill all Jews from rural areas. And this is what they do. And here is also when a lot of locals, they get involved into the killings of their neighbors. And here in the case of Pepin, everything happened in the month of July, and around close to 300 people, Jews, were gathered in a public building, which used to be a school building. And only 3 gendarmes, Romanian gendarmes, were present in the village. But in help to the action of killing came over 50 locals, most of them men in their 20s and 30s. So they came with agricultural tools because they did not have enough guns. They came with bats, with tools, and the Romanians initially threw a couple of grenades inside the building, and then the villagers stepped inside and finished off the small and old and children and women and men. Here's the monument that you see. And here is like an excerpt from the deposition of a person who was put on trial after the massacre. He explained how they all entered armed with strong clubs, with which you could easily kill a person. Equally, each of us took part in trying to make it impossible for the Jews to escape from the building, he means. While the shooting was going on, we used bats to kill anyone trying to escape through the window. There were times when the defenseless victims, rushing from one side to the other, headed towards the window, hoping to be saved. But after seeing us, they jumped back because they were around the perimeter, and some of them entered inside. However, if they succeeded, then our blows simply made them squeeze back into the room where they were finished off. I personally hit a Jew in the head when he stuck it out the window and tried to run, and killed him with one strike. Beside guarding the building outside, the persons I have indicated were inside the building and killed the Jews with clubs, meaning some were armed with guns. Meanwhile, some were armed with guns. Then they shot the Jews point blank. And so here, as I mentioned, the logic, the state logic is less transparent to me about like why they made this decision to kill Jews in rural area. But the logic of those like who participated from the villagers is very similar to what has been discussed before. And the whole array of factors that we are discussing, they're all known in Holocaust studies, they're all present in this and other villages from Bessarabia and Bukovina. Another kind of unusual way of killing is happening during the deportations, because those Jews who lived in towns in the fall of 1941, they were deported to Transnistria. Most of these deportations, they were taken by foot. And the Romanians presumably were very proud about being very organized and having this deportation in a very orderly manner. So they made itineraries, they decided on which day they had a schedule of convoys, how many people should be in the convoys. But as you can see on these photographs, this photograph one, and there are a multiplicity of them, you have people who have to walk by foot, old and young, women carrying children, and they were supposed to walk usually for about like 30 kilometers per day. This meant that by default, you'd have a segment of the deportees that physically will not be able to make it through this march. So the Romanians prepared the documents and they think ahead about this, and there is an order that at every 10 kilometers on the itinerary, some gendarmes should go ahead and prepare pits for those who are not able to carry on and to shoot them. So you have a segment of population, and we're talking about like 25,000 people who are killed just because the Romanians want a orderly deportation. And they could be young, they could be old, sick, or with children. And here I highlighted on this document that if somebody is trying to oppose to the deportation, then it was a keyword, Alexianu, meaning they should be shot. In Segell, the village that I mentioned earlier, we have a case when about like 30 people were taken outside from the convoy, and 2 gendarmes were involved in the killing. And meanwhile, also several locals also volunteered to participate to the killing. This is what they did. And in 1944, they were arrested, interrogated, then a number of 12 witnesses were summoned to the court. And this is how we know about this case, for example, because unlike cases that happen inside of a village, in the center of the village, these kind of cases were happening randomly, you know, on a route to somewhere by a ravine. So it's very difficult for the locals to know who were the people who were killed, and otherwise, even like the location of this kind of massacres is like more difficult to identify today. But there are pretty much everywhere on the entire territory of deportations along the route. So the case from Dubasari, it brings into the light the fact that participants to the Holocaust, even on the territory that was under the Romanian administration, were also Germans. And Einsatzgruppe D, which was passing through this area, was doing what they were understanding as their goal, securing the rear of the German front. And as part of the multiplicity of tasks that they had, including to secure the bridge and so on, they were doing mass murder. And this case happened in Dubasari in September, and it took quite some time, for about like 2 weeks. They killed over 6,000 people from an entire district. And they summoned the local population, asked them to dig pits under the allegation that these like huge pits that you see on this photograph, behind the monument, these are actually pits 15 meters long and about 11 pits there. The Germans explained that they need to preserve vegetables for the winter. But when the pits were ready, they basically took people from the ghetto that was created in Dubasari and shot them all, men, women, and children. And they were asking women with small children, with babies, to keep them at their length's arm so that they would be able to shoot the babies as well. And the children who were a little bit older, they were forced to kneel on the edge of the pit and killed together with the adults. And in this case, probably the reason, like people who study German perpetrators and the Nazis side probably know better in what kind of rationale was behind. And definitely I know Christoph Dickmann's argument about, the concerns about like food safety, but definitely the ideology was there, and it was feeling strong enough in perceiving these Jews, the local Jews, the Soviet Jews, as being like a danger. And at this point, it was clear that it didn't matter if they were young or old. And this initial concern of just killing men was overcome, and now they were killing everybody. And here's the document that was put as part of the investigations that started after the war. The killings from Odessa from October 1941, it was a different kind of killing. And here, the reason is actually a bomb that exploded on October 22nd in 1941, 6 days after the Romanians and Germans entered the city. And 61 people were killed, including Romanian and German officers and soldiers. So Antonescu ordered reprisals, and he wanted the execution of 1 hostage for each soldier and 2 hostages for each German or Romanian officer. And next day, the Romanian general Constantin Trestoreanu, he already reported that he hanged in the public squares of Odessa about 5,000 people, mostly Jews. What happened the next day, Antonescu said that he wanted the execution of all Bessarabian Jewish refugees to Odessa, basically showing how much upset he was by the fact that these Jews tried to escape from the advancing Romanian authorities, that they were choosing to go into the Soviet rear. And also he insisted that actually the individuals who will be punished, they will be locked up in a previously mined building and blown up, and this should be done on the day of burials of our victims. And he ordered that the water to be destroyed after being read, but luckily this did not happen, because like people were definitely concerned about their own like safety when someday they'll have to pay about this. Maybe what I'll explain what happened. So there are debates about the numbers, but we know that at least 16,000 people from Odessa, most of them Jews, because the order also mentioned like communists and Jews, but the communists were not waiting and like sitting very much like in Odessa and waiting for the Romanians and Germans to come. Probably they were the first one to flee the city. but the bulk of it was the Jewish population. So they were moved into the outskirts of Dalnik and placed in barns there. And then they were gunned with machine guns and sprayed with gasoline and set on fire. And indeed, it was also a building was mined and exploded exactly on the same time when the explosion happened in the military headquarters. And actually was like one of the first acts of official punishment of the Romanians for the war crimes, the Odessa massacre. Now, the last case that I want to bring here, and I'm still watching my clock, this is the murder from Bogdanovka. And here you see that's right on the border of the Bug River, on the bank of Bug River. This was the delimiting area between Romanian area of control, and then across the river there were Germans in control. This is the biggest site of massacre in Ukraine. Here, almost 50,000 people were killed during 2 weeks in the winter of like 1941, 1942. And actually this number is bigger than the number of victims at Babi Yar, number of Jewish victims, which is estimated at 32,000. But still very few people know about this site. And here, the rationale behind it's really puzzling and bizarre. But the point is that initially in September there were only 1,000 people here, deportees. But by December there were almost like 50,000 people crammed on the territory of what used to be a collective farm and what used to be a farm to raise pigs during Soviet times. So these 50,000 people, they were crammed inside the pigsties, but most of them would not fit. So they were also laying outside in snow and frost. So a typhus broke out and people started dying. And the Romanian authorities, but also the Germans across the Bug, they were worried about the spread of typhus. So they were looking for a solution. And on December 16, when speaking about typhus in Transnistria, not necessarily about Bogdanovka in particular, Antonescu said, like, you know, I am not interested. You do whatever you need to do, but clean the territory of Jews, like make clear and make order in this area. We don't want a repetition of World War I, when a lot of Romanian soldiers died because of typhus. And so basically that was the launch for the local authorities to decide that the solution to this medical epidemical problem is mass murder. And this is what they did. They started shooting Jewish prisoners from this place, and with the help of Ukrainian auxiliary and with the help of German auxiliaries. And this ended in January 1942, but the burning of bodies was still going on until March 1942. And only about like 120 people were survivors of Bogdanovka. So here, as you can see, the rationale that kind of prompted this huge mass murder was like concern over the sanitary situation of this region. And here is a very like inconspicuous like monument, like that probably nobody's seen it in the entire life. So the conclusion is that of course both Romanians and German militaries, but also civilian groups, they all mingled in this mass murder against Jews. And the war is crucial for the Holocaust in Romania. And while in 1941, the Romanian government still did not embrace the complete extermination of the Jewish population, it was determined to destroy the Jewish communities from rural areas and wanted to deport further east the population from urban area. And it's also clear that the experience of 1940 and the humiliation that the state suffered was an important factor in Antonescu's war of terrain cleansing, and to a great extent what happened in Odessa, but also fear of this like so-called Jewish solidarity with the Soviets in the condition of war. And also what these cases show to us, that killings undertaken for reasons of non-ideological character, as the one in Bogdanovka that I just described, can and were even more lethal than the operations that were implemented based on ideological grounds. And the concentration of killings of Jews by the Romanian authorities took place in 1941-42, but of course this didn't mean that the Jews were not dying after that until basically 1944, when most of them were liberated from the concentration camps in Transnistria. Thank you very much. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana, for limiting these 6 modes, which shed fresh light on the social dynamics surrounding the killings and the policies. Now, we're very lucky to have with us Natalia Aleksiun, who's the Harry Rich Professor of Holocaust Studies at the University of Florida at Gainesville. She holds doctoral degrees from Warsaw University and NYU, and specializes in the social, political, and cultural history of modern East European Polish Jewry, the Holocaust, Polish Jews, Polish and Jewish historiography, and so forth. I will just mention a 2021 book, Conscious History, Polish Jewish Historians Before the Holocaust, and Dokat Dalec, which was published, Where To? The Zionist Movement in Poland, 1950, published in Polish in 2002. She co-edited several volumes. I will just mention the volume 3 of European Holocaust Studies titled Places, Space, and Voids in the Holocaust from last year. And she also serves as the co-editor of East European Jewish Affairs. Currently, she's completing a new book about Jews in hiding in Eastern Galicia. So who better to give a response than Natalia? Her 2017 article, Intimate Violence, Jewish Testimonies on Victims and Perpetrators in Eastern Galicia, was centrally, I would argue, to really setting off the topic of intimacy. So dear Natalia, delighted to have you with us. The Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you, Jan. And as my predecessors, I wanted to say thank you for putting together this event, bringing us all together. And it's an honor to be speaking in such illustrious company with people whose work inspires my own. And I will, we've been discussing already for an hour, almost and a half, and it's really important that we have time for a conversation, and there is already a conversation happening in the chat. So let me just drag us a little bit back to intimate violence and some of the questions that these 3 presentations raised for me, and hopefully this will be useful for all of us. So in a way, what Diana especially presented, I think raises a question of how imperative the category of intimate violence really is for the study of the Holocaust, because arguably what we heard was those very important developments, political, ideological, practical ways in which the violence is justified and narrated, and intimacy doesn't seem to be a central aspect of it. So I wanted already ahead of this to ask Diana if you think with in the context of your work about intimacy, how do you see, where do you see the place of violence? Is it in the actual killing process, close shooting people, close relation in this moment of death, or do you insert intimacy in any of those scenarios that you presented? Then there is a context of scales and layers. I think that the work that especially Robert, you alluded to and you brought us to, and Saulius as well, these are often micro-historical studies. And all of the 3 papers showed us how important local context or geography, as Diana, you put it, is for the story, but is intimacy ultimately a micro-historical category? Can we use it for a macro-historical perspective on the Holocaust? And I think, Robert, again, what you started doing very much showed how this is a category that we can apply across geography and across chronology. But I would love to push on those questions a little further. Then there is a question of configurations and contexts in which this intimate violence plays out. And here, again, the first paper for me brought up in a most direct way various situations. So there is treason, there is previous knowledge of perpetrators and victims, or persecutors, as you put it, because you start earlier with more of persecution and symbolic violence than physical violence and killing necessarily. But Jan, in your own work, I think it comes up very much how in the context of passing, familiarity, knowledge of Jews and people whom they meet can be a deadly category, and this intimacy is really a tool that plays a practical role in betrayal. The context of looting and property, I think, is very crucial, and it's not just as motivation, but I think that there is kind of epistemological knowledge of, meaning if people know a particular Jewish family or particular Jewish individual, they know what is in the house. That knowledge implies that they had been there, that they know what kind of property might be expected inside, what might be the tempting aspects of what a particular person or family owns. For example, I don't know, physician's equipment in a physician's office that may be taken over by another physician. There is also the intimate knowledge of who exactly are the members of the family. And this comes up in my own research in a lot of situations when people are taken out of their homes during roundups, and those locals that participate know exactly how many children live in this house. So if a child is missing, they are in a position to say, wait a moment, there is one more child that we should find. So those implications play out in various configurations, not just in a sense of, this could be neighbors, classmates, business partners, patients of physicians, etc., but in different situational contexts as the Holocaust plays out. I'm very puzzled also about the usefulness of the category in terms of small town, rural settings and urban settings. And just between those 3 papers, I think it takes us or gives us a taste that this is a category that could be used very much everywhere, right? Because there is intimacy and knowledge in the house, in the apartment building. Janitors are just one category that have been studied in Nazi-occupied Poland, as well as in Budapest and in other places, but also maybe especially in small towns and rural situations where really everybody knows everybody. I would also want to point out to something that was somewhat marginal to the presentations and that I'm very interested in, which is the textual aspect of these intimacies, meaning what people say to one another because they know one another. And some of these conversations both in the context of pogroms, and Joanna Tokarska-Bakir has a fantastic text, a book really about pogrom cries. What the crowd in the midst of a pogrom says. But these conversations, tragic conversations, are also recorded in testimonies and in court trials, happening during roundups, loading people onto trains, finding hiding places. And a lot of these conversations actually touch on the issue of familiarity, where when people call on each other by first names. And Jan Tomasz Gross wrote about it in Neighbors. This was something that he found very striking when you read closely the events in Jedwabne, and then in Anna Beacon's sort of broader study of the event in Crime and Silence, this comes across even stronger. But I saw the conversation in the chat about what really intimacy means, and I want to raise it and amplify it again, because I don't think of intimacy as simply being familiar with someone from before the war. I think it implies some kind of closer familiarity, some kind of maybe even emotional entanglement. Doesn't need to be a deep friendship, but a passing knowledge that this is a Jew who lives at this address. I'm not sure that this falls for me necessarily under the category of intimacy in the context of the Holocaust. And that raises also a question to Saulius, what you were saying, I believe. What is really the place of belonging? What is the degree to which Jews belong and are considered part of the local communities, whether this is a house or a street or a village or a nation in civic terms? And if people call each other by first names, as they're being murdered, when people say, you know, Janek, why are you doing this? We know each other from school, right? What does it really mean? And yet it seems to me that in victims' testimonies, anger was mentioned, anger at the Jews, and there is certainly a lot of history of emotions that I think we need to utilize when working on intimacy in the Holocaust. But there is certainly a sense of great surprise or sense of betrayal that is recorded in victims' accounts. And I think that intimacy is something that helps us understand the trope of Ukrainians were worse than Germans, Lithuanians were worse than Germans, Poles were worse than Germans. And these are always things that are being said by Jews who experienced the Holocaust or whose families experienced the Holocaust in that local setting. Polish Jews don't necessarily say that Lithuanians were worse than Jews. It's the Lithuanian Jews say that, and the Polish Jews say that. And I think that boils to their experience of betrayal in the context of intimate violence. And it takes me to my last point, and I'm really trying to not take over the conversation. I would love to hear back from the speakers and from the audience, is the question of chronology. And Saulius, you touched on it, and I think this was also present in Robert's comments. When do we start, right? The violence, if we think of not pogroms and not mass shootings, but symbolic violence, exclusionary violence in Eastern Europe, it's certainly happening before Barbarossa or before September 1st. And so in the new Polish Holocaust historiography, there has been more and more pushing against this very clean divide and looking at the pre-war violence and pre-war exclusion as something that, as a phenomena that need to be taken very seriously to understand the relations and ultimately the fate of Jews, especially those who escaped from deportations. And so how do we look at the intimacy before the war, and how then this gets transformed? And last thing, I'm very interested in that, Robert, in what you said about intimacy, not just predating the Holocaust, not only gendarmes knowing Jews that they were overseeing in those forced labor battalions, but also intimacy that is comes into being, that appears, that is forged during the war. And here it opens, I think, a whole new window into relations between Jews and non-Jews in the context of hiding and passing. These might be people who know one another, but often these are sort of random situations. And yet after a year and a half, 2 years, sometimes very strong, but also very ambivalent bonds can be created. And that's also part of intimacy and intimate violence during the Holocaust. Thank you very much for this very inspiring beginning of a conversation.
Thank you, dear Natalia. Why won't we just turn over to the speakers, and maybe we can precisely get about to into a discussion like this. Whoever wants to start, whoever wants to respond to the comments that Natalia made.
Kind of go ahead, because Natalia had the feeling that the first questions were addressed to me. So you asked, like, do I see intimacy, and do I insert it in the scenarios that I study or like present, and is it useful at all? And I do see it like everywhere in all incidents. I could have gone into like tiny details and of intimacy that is observed, reported, experienced by the whatever people who were involved in this, perpetrators, victims, bystanders, and everybody else who doesn't have a role that fits into any of these like simplistic categories. For example, one guy who participated to the massacre from Pepin, he reported during the investigation that he knew the woman, a young woman, because they worked together in her father's shop. So that young woman, she lost a leg. She was all covered in blood because of the explosion of the grenade. So she started offering him the ring and money that she had, and asked him if he could shoot her, because she did not want to be killed with a bat or with a hoe. And he said he did not have a gun. So he went outside and asked a buddy to come and like help with this. So you do see these actions. You do see it even like in Dubasar, where one German was actually a local because he was a translator, and he was one of the Volksdeutsche who just immigrated to Germany like a year or two before the war, in the exchange kind of programs. And he was in a dialogue with a victim. They're everywhere. And I think like you kind of half explained, responded to the same question. I do see it especially useful when we're dealing with emotions. I think that's the key to unlock emotions. When speaking about emotion, I think that's the tool. And there is an array of emotions, and some of them are easier to unlock or to be understood with a clear analytical set of tools, such, for example, revenge is kind of more clear-cut, or, anger is like more clear-cut. But in the case that I just described was the guy who has like, for me, at the same time, intimacy has some capacities of understanding emotions, but also at a certain point, you go to a black box. and you don't know what's inside. And I see this as a limitation of this tool, because you cannot understand more than this. And it's a black box of what's going on in one person's mind and the person's understanding of the situation. And I feel like helpless as a researcher, and I feel like I should not probably go there and not risk like even speculating about just like what was happening in the person's mind and how they were dealing in their mindset with that. And so I think it's good, it's useful, but it definitely has a limitation in such a complex like material that we work with, like human nature. And I saw that it was a question about the Odessa from Emmanuel. Emmanuel asked about if this Judeo-Bolshevik trope had a role that played a role in Antonescu's decision to basically organize this mass killing, and that the Jews were kind of conflated with communists. That's definitely the case. Actually, this was a central cause to what's happening in Odessa. And this, the Romanian authorities, they were ready somehow to start killing even before the explosion, because the defense of Odessa was quite long, and the Romanians were quite angered of this resistance put against them, and they were specifically blaming communists and Bolsheviks. They were specifically talking about that if they were not for these Jews, like Bolsheviks, who were like basically chasing soldiers or putting up this resistance, they would have taken the city much earlier. So this is how they were framing what was happening in the field, and they were ready to strike, because in their mind they already depicted them as the guilty one. I'll stop here so others could also speak. Thank you very much.
If I can also then respond to some of the things that were said, Christoph's comments also in the chat and what came up now in the discussion. I have to admit that when I started thinking about this subject, when I was writing this book about the Hungarian forced laborers, which would be sometime between 2005 and 2009, more or less, so it's quite a while ago now, the thing that I was trying to find a term in my own thought that was the opposite of the anonymity of the Holocaust. Because again, that's the main way many people understand it, where it's anonymous murder. But there are situations, many situations, where the murderer knows, or the persecutor, whether they're murdering or persecuting, knows the person they're persecuting, and vice versa. So is that intimacy? I'm not sure. Maybe it's not the best term, because maybe intimacy implies much more than that. Or maybe there's grades of it also. But I really feel there's something very qualitatively different between when something anonymous happens and when something happens to people who know one another. And just think about reading a newspaper, and if you read about some tragic thing and you don't know who the victim is, you look at it one way. And if you look at it and say, wow, I know that person, you look at it a different way. So what does this mean to it all? I'm not sure. I just think there's a difference between that anonymous persecution and where the victim and the persecutor know one another. There's something qualitatively different about it. I don't know. We need to go to maybe psychology and sociology and other things to try to understand why that is so, but I think it's true. But of course, I'm just what I'm feeling about it, as opposed to something I can actually prove. And again, the other thing is, what does it mean for the persecution of the Holocaust? Well, certainly it does take us away from this very older idea that many people still have about the bureaucratic nature of things, and that it was all kind of cold-blooded. And it certainly wasn't. It was often, but it wasn't always. Is that microhistory? Well, it's not on the level of setting policy, I don't think. Although you could argue, I suppose, in some places there's policies about our Jews and the Jews that aren't our Jews, but that's maybe not intimacy either. But there is something in the microhistory, but the microhistory, again, we understand our history from all kinds of pieces of fragments that we're putting together as we look at it. And I think that it is microhistory, but I think as we look at it as a larger picture and see how it fits in different places, it does inform us about aspects of the Holocaust. I don't think we've done enough about it to answer the questions of exactly what it's telling us. I think there's a lot more to be done on the subject. for us to really understand what it really does mean. But I go back again, there is something, at least that I feel very deeply, that's different between something very anonymous and something that isn't anonymous, something where people know each other in some ways, and they can know each other just from the level that this is the neighbor named Isaac, through somebody who they might have had a lot of contact with over the years for one thing or another, or somebody who they were hiding and then betrayed. And that's the other thing I want to bring up, that the issue of betrayal is very important here from the side of the victims. The idea of being betrayed, I think that is something that's very strong when they know their persecutors, or when the persecutors are people among whom they live. I think there's a very strong issue of betrayal here. For the persecutors themselves, for the perpetrators, then that's not, I don't know, again, I'm not sure where that fits exactly, but they know the people, they know, again, it's just not this anonymous thing. So I think there's something to it. I'm not 100% sure what it means. I think it's something we need to pursue more. And as I said from the beginning, I also think that it is something that cuts through the history from the beginnings all the way through the end. You can see this is a piece of it. And maybe someday we'll do enough research that we can quantify that. And then, say, well, this was 30% important for something. I don't know. We can't say that yet, but I do think it's very worth looking into. So anyway, those are some of my feelings based on some of the things that were said now in the chat and also in the discussion.
May I, for a moment?
I think, Natalia, I think, Natalia, you want to respond to Rob's point, so maybe we can put you in between, and we would ask Sylvia to. But
I also would love, thank you. I would also love Saulius to have a chance. But I want to say because I can see in our audience. I don't know, Tova, if you want to be called up, but we have this is in a way part of the story apropos how intimacy can have an actual face, a situation in which the perpetrator was not just familiar with the family, but this was a perpetrator who spoke Yiddish because he worked in a Jewish bakery. So it has, I agree, Robert, that it has a tremendous scope and shades, but it definitely takes us very far from anonymity and industrial, well-organized, well-oiled process. So I think it's a piece of a puzzle that needs to be added, not just because it was experienced in that way by many victims, but because it broadens the question of how this happens. We don't have here arguably someone that was anti-Semitic, or Saulius, you were talking people who were involved in some kind of anti-Jewish propaganda before the war, someone who lived, spoke the Jewish language, worked with Jews, and then became part of that historical event that we study as the Holocaust. Just wanted to.
Yeah, maybe we can now move to Saulius just to give him a chance to respond to what Natalia said in her response.
I don't have that much to respond with that. There was one question on chat about Judeo-Bolshevik mythology, energizing local perpetrators. Quite true, yes. Without the Judeo-Bolshevik thing, Nazi propaganda just doesn't work, in Lithuania at least. It's not effective. And let's remember that they used Soviet atrocities as sort of anti-Jewish vehicles. They would take Jews to these places and have them bury the bodies and wash them. This happens in Ukraine as well. And this is a performance, kind of performative anti-Semitism, and it's closely tied to that. And the question Mr. Foster also asked was whether non-Jewish communists engaged in anti-Jewish activity as a way of repentance and sort of getting back into the graces of society. Quite true. That happened. We have some evidence for that. The last thing, I prefer the term familiarity rather than intimacy on some level, because a lot depends on simple geography. I'll give you one example. Lithuanian perpetrators or government officials in Vilnius during the German occupation had very little chance to be familiar with any Jews, just simply because of history and geography. Situation in Kaunas was very different. And so locale also decides how much familiarity does the killer have with the victim. and particularly with the roll commandos, the mobile killing squads, I mean, a disproportionate amount of victims are being killed by these roving mobile killing squads, some of them coming from centralized authorities in Kaunas. And these killers don't know necessarily the victims very well, or not at all familiar with them. There's another issue too that I don't know, I would be interested to see if somebody else came up with. Local people were sometimes forced to use their wagons, local peasants, to convoy Jewish families to ghettos. We have that in the literature. These are people they know. They are neighbors, or they live on the next street or whatever. And you read some accounts of this. Some people are very upset by this. They don't want to do it. Other people are not. But they're involved in this. And that's another level of this kind of familiarity or intimacy with the entire process. So I think that's, another thing to consider. And again, I would urge people who listen to my presentation on the final thing, the link with Christoph Diekmann's explanation of years ago is a fairly good survey of where the research is now on this issue. So yeah, and in terms of also mentioned by Natalia, the chronology. The chronology is not as clean cut. You're right, as I may have implied. I'm using it in general terms, but some of these things overlap. They do. For example, Hilberg's famous four stages to destruction, or 3 stages to actual destruction, they somewhat overlap. They're all there in the Lithuanian context, for example, in particular with local institutions, but sometimes they overlap or are not so clean cut chronologically as is sometimes presented. So I do appreciate very much your input. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I know we have more people asking questions and interested in the topic, so I think we would have to reconvene at some point later on. As the tradition goes, for now, I think it's time to give the floor to Boaz. Thank you to all 4 for your excellent papers, insights, and comments. And Boaz, as the tradition wants it, the floor is yours.
Thank you. As I said, I'm speaking from my grandchildren's room, so that's a different background than the usual academic background I have. I think that we have really scratched the surface only, but some issues are very much important for me to talk about. I'll say 2 or 3 things. One, I know these stories, and I don't stop being shocked. I mean, I grimace if you saw my face when my computer did work. I teach this stuff. When I was in Kovna in Kaunas, I did every effort not to get to that garage. It's a traumatic place for me, although I was never there. I was running in the town and saying just not to pass near this place. This was, and this is where I think we may be missing on the Judeo-Bolshevik issue that was really strong here. I think this is much more than Judeo-Bolshevism. The ability to kill someone you know or you drank with. I'm not now talking people who really knew. To rape your classmate from high school regularly in a ghetto. This stuff is what I meet when I do children's testimonies. The rescuers who become murderers. I mean, you are killing people you really know. So there has to be something really deep inside here, not only Judeo-Bolshevism is a political ideology, I'll say. I mean, it's not the best description, but maybe for this. What about Christian anti-Semitism? The othering of the Jew that, as Natalia has said, and he said many times, the pre-war period that othered the Jew very strongly all over Europe. We still don't have the answers. This is what I'm trying to say. We still don't have these answers, but I'm sure, but for me at least, Judeo-Bolshevik vision, which I really like to teach my students about, is not the answer for this story. It's heads up, but it's not the answer. For this is something deeper, and as we said from the first moment of this event, seminar, there's still much to do. I really thank all the speakers. I learned a lot, as usual, from the speakers, from the response, and next month you will hear us talking about a total war. We'll take a bit of a move from intimate violence. And I would want to say, I was living under the impression that we've sent everyone on our mailing list the information on our new innovation and entrepreneurship course. We are opening the third year now for students and faculty from all over the world. We had people from 16 countries before, and some of the people here were in this course. We're opening registration now. I've put it up in a lot of Facebook places, on Twitter, LinkedIn. We missed sending the mails, which is like a really. We still have a month for registration, and we will make every effort that every one of you can know about this course and can really recommend this to his students. This is an academic course teaching people to do startups in Holocaust memory. So we really recommend this. And if you are already interested, PM me, find a way to make contact with one of us, and we'll give you better information. So thank you, all of you, and good night. It's here. And see you soon, face to face.
Thanks, everyone. I think that if some of you are still here, I think that Sylvia and Dina Porat wants to make a short comment. So maybe you can go ahead, but really be short. Please, Sylvia, go ahead.
I think that the definition of intimate violence is based on behaviorist assumption that the previously valid set of value systems indeed is in place, but the cluster of unleashed permissions to violence under pseudo-ideological, some kind of legitimization, unfortunately make assume never happened, does not exist. And this institutions free world, actually, I think, is the most appropriate approach, or might be, I only dare to suggest, might be an approach which explains the phenomenon of intimate violence, because it somehow explains how people perceive each other as almost in a situation of unleashed aggressivity of tabula rasa, as if they never knew each other, as if this is simply some kind of a theoretical exercise, if this could be instrumental to understand this phenomenon, because it seems like the behaviorist assumptions do not apply. People knew each other, they respected each other, they had a whole set of assumptions and strategic, let me say, approaches in a game theoretic setting that were some kind structured by custom, structured by legal structures, let's say of Weimar Germany. All of a sudden, all of this vanishes totally and completely. So actually, there is a created in vitro understanding, conception, and institutions free world, which simply an aggressivity is unleashed by the party who is stronger towards a party who is weaker, who has not the possibility to deter the violence. And there is an unprecedented situation, which actually the definition of intimate violence, people who knew each other, they don't know each other. This is a situation which is blind because they don't know the situation. So there's a cluster of theories that permits, maybe it is the Goldhagen definition, Jews as sinners, that allows this. That is, that puts the Jewish people outside of all of a sudden, like trajectories, the Jewish people outside of every set of inhibitions created by custom. Sorry if I took too much time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so important. And Dina Porat, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. Chris sent me a private note. Hi, Saulius, everyone. Let me be short. I would like to join Saulius' suggestion to replace the intimacy with familiarity. Because, Rob, you know my opinion. We have argued about it many times in Yad Vashem. Intimacy is a close connection. It's a deep connection. It also implies something positive, intimacy. And I think that it covers too much. It covers too many cases. As I think Sylvia right now said, too many cases. There are grades, there are steps, there are different ways of knowing people. So that I think intimacy is too much. And let's start with familiarity. Another note is to Saulius. You said, I'll be short again, that on August 1941, the policy changed and the killing of children and women started. You didn't say why. And may I suggest something that we perhaps can speak about in another seminar, that there wasn't, not just that the Germans dictated the policy, but the local population. We saw it also in Diana's lecture. The local population, which is sometimes fiercer and more cruel and quicker to kill than the Germans, influences and has an impact on the German policy. These were the Lithuanians who first killed women and children. And then the Germans changed a policy. I think that with the host of materials that we have now, once more archives are opened, we see more and more how deep, how wide was the participation of local population. We had an excellent seminar workshop in Yad Vashem on 3 days, on camps not initiated or established by Germans, but by local population. It was horrible. You know, at the end of this seminar, we came out devastated because it was all over. So I think that this point should be perhaps explained more by you, Saulius, but and congratulations on the upcoming book. Thank you, everyone. It was very interesting.
Thank you, everyone. Sorry, Boaz, go ahead.
No.
So I want to thank everyone again and have a good night, good day, and see you next time with us.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
And may Argentina win the Copa.
Goodbye.
All right, thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.